Hi, welcome to Intro to Soc. This week we're going to be talking about deviance and conformity. So here's the agenda for this week. We're going to talk about what is deviance, how do we respond to deviant behavior, what purpose does the written law serve, is all deviance criminal, what's crime, how does crime change over time, and what are some sociological explanations for crime. So we're going to kind of dig back into theory, and why does learning about crime matter? So first, what is deviance? Deviance is essentially any behavior or action that violates a given society's norms and values. So again, this might include hygiene, dress, etiquette, frugality, hard work. Hopefully you can kind of remember back to those when we talked about culture. Basically, people who do deviant behavior don't play by the rules of a society. Keep in mind that deviance is not the same thing as crime. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but just to make that very clear at the outset, deviance is not the same thing as crime. Behaviors can be deviant, meaning they can be pretty weird, kind of awkward, but they're not necessarily criminal, and we don't necessarily perceive them as dangerous, at least dangerous enough to warrant a police response. So how do we respond to deviance? Well, because deviance is a violation of the norms and values of a society, those are the things that help us to make sense of the world. Those are our shortcuts. Those are the things that help us know what to expect. So we tend to respond to violations of those norms and values with feelings of confusion or fear. We can be really concerned, and we can even be really suspicious. So how society reacts to a deviant act depends on the perceived dangerousness or the severity of the act. So hopefully you can remember back to Moors and Folkways a while back. You saw that picture of Ted Bundy. He was definitely in a different class of violation. He was violating a Moor, so that has a very strong moral attachment. So if somebody violates that more, they're going to be punished pretty severely. So some deviant behaviors are deemed more excusable than others. So when a bunch of people or groups of people deviate publicly, it can seem as though the social world is just kind of disordered and pretty chaotic. Again, we don't know much about human behavior, but we do know that we like things to make sense. And deviance violates our expectations of order. So who is deviant? What does it mean to be deviant? Well, deviants aren't necessarily only just weirdos, outcasts, or criminals. We aren't totally off the hook ourselves. Most of us can't follow the rules of a society 100% of the time. We need to take shortcuts. We might get a little sloppy out in public if we've just been to Aggieville or something. We want to be able to explore our identities and feel like we're a unique individual and not just a sheep following the herd. We like the feeling of individual expression and the feeling of being a little bit different. So many of us technically deviate the social order every single day. So it's not necessarily very noticeable, probably not very extreme, not necessarily going to warrant a police response, but it's pretty common. A lot of us drink underage. Technically, that's violating the written law. So that is pretty major, even though it's kind of accepted. A lot of us speed to school every day. Some of us walk against foot traffic. So again, deviance isn't just reserved for weirdos, outcasts, and criminals. We do it every single day too. So next, let's talk about subculture. So not everybody in a society necessarily rejects deviance. Most of the time, deviants also have friends who are connected to groups who might support their behavior, even when broader society doesn't. So subcultures are groups of people who share a set of unique cultural ideas about what's normal, what's valuable, or what's moral, and it might be a little bit different from what we think of in broader society, but they remain at least somewhat committed to mainstream culture. So even if somebody belongs to a goth subculture, most of the time they still have jobs, they still go to school, they still want to feel financially secure. So it's not like they're just completely out there, totally disconnected. They still have some investment within the culture as it is, but they still have some different ideas and different values, and they do have a group that supports them in that thinking. So why do we usually conform? First of all, what is conformity? Conformity is the opposite of deviance. It's any behavior that adheres to or abides by a given society's norms and values. So essentially, if you're conforming, you're towing the societal line. So we're going to talk a little bit about sanctions. So for every socially approved action, there's a sanction. You might have heard the term sanction when we're talking about crime specifically, but all it is a consequence. And a consequence can be good or bad. So there's two types of sanctions. First of all, it can be a positive or a negative sanction. So positive sanctions, so you conform, you do something well, you do something society likes. They might bestow you with some honor, privilege, popularity, awards. So it's still a sanction, it's still a consequence of your behavior, but it's not a bad one. Meanwhile, you have negative sanctions or negative consequences. So if you violate the norm and choose not to conform, you might be you might experience isolation from other people, you might feel like you're being rejected, you might experience ridicule. And there's two primary ways that we in society give negative sanctions. So the first way we do it is formally. A formal sanction or formal consequence for a deviant behavior results in a response from the police or the criminal justice system. So if you commit a crime, you're likely to face the sanction of jail, prisons, fines. Meanwhile, you can also get informal sanctions for negative behavior, deviant behavior. These don't necessarily draw a lot of attention or require police. It's not necessarily perceived as dangerous, but it does happen, and we are nevertheless disturbed by it. So somebody who receives an informal sanction for their deviance might be subject to humiliation, rejection, and teasing. So you're not going to walk away in handcuffs, but it doesn't mean that there's no consequence for your behavior. So let's talk a little bit about the written law. So the written law or legislation kind of dictates what behaviors are considered formally acceptable or acceptable, what behaviors are subject to formal sanctions. So the law tells us what behaviors are absolutely unacceptable, and if you do commit those behaviors, you will likely come into contact with the police or criminal justice system employees in some shape or form. So the law is essentially a guidebook to our society's norms and values. It tells us about the consequences of violating these laws. So the law tells us basically where we as a society draw the line between harmless behavior and harmful behavior that requires a police response. It tells us what the formal sanctions will be if we do choose to violate the law. So we kind of have an idea what the consequences are if we choose to murder somebody. But remember that the law wasn't created in a vacuum. Try to reflect back to social constructionism. We talked about the social reality of crime. So the law changes over time. Essentially, you can think of the law as being a reflection of our collective understanding of what behavior is acceptable at a given time in history. So the things that are on our law books now are totally different from the things that were on the law books back in the 1930s. So for example, interracial marriage used to be completely illegal and you could get severely punished for it. Now, which is a good thing, we don't believe that. You know, we have come to find interracial marriage to be acceptable. So therefore, we've adjusted the laws. So again, the law is just a guidebook to what our norms and values are and is subject to change kind of based on the changes to our collective consciousness and our collective understanding of what's acceptable. So what if you decide to take your chances? This is where we're going to start talking about crime. So what is crime? So again, crime is not the same thing as deviance. These are not synonymous terms. Some deviant behaviors might be labeled as crimes or might be deemed criminal. So some behaviors that are deviant are just kind of weird. They make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. You know, if somebody's wearing something really funky, we're not going to arrest them. We might give them kind of a strange look, but again, it's not criminal. So some deviant behaviors are odd and might earn you a nasty look, but they're not going to wind you up in the back of a police car in handcuffs. So they're not dangerous. They're just kind of weird. So crime is a violation of the written law, like we just talked about on the last slide. It's generally associated with some kind of formal sanction. And again, we have formal versus informal sanctions. Formal, that's where you're going to come into contact with the police and the courts. So it's a crime, you're going to draw the attention of the police. You are probably going to face some sort of fines, jail time, court appearances, a prison sentence, something like that. Criminal deviance, that's going to include everything we think of when we think of crime. So the things that are on the written law books. So we know that we can't murder, we can't steal. If we speed, you're not necessarily going to go to prison for it, but you're probably going to get a fine. It is technically against the law. Meanwhile, non-criminal deviance, you know, the things that are pretty harmless, but they're just kind of weird to us. They're definitely a violation, but we're not going to lock somebody up for them. Things like bad hygiene, if you're really rude out in public, if you are wearing strange dress. Again, you can't do anything about them formally, but they are a little weird. So crime and criminal definitions aren't eternal, again, like we just talked about. Because we aren't eternal, we're always changing, society is always expanding and building. We can't expect that our definitions of crime are going to stay the same, and that the laws that we have on the books 25 years ago are going to be the same today. So it isn't eternal, it is subject to change. So as society changes and we start to change our minds and become maybe a little bit more open to new things, starting to implement new cultures into our own, we're going to make adjustments to the law and make some things that were once criminal no longer subject to criminal penalties anymore. We just don't see the point. So again, we talked about interracial marriage that used to be totally illegal. Now it's not. More recently, more states have begun to legalize marijuana use, whereas that used to be very illegal, and people are still facing, pretty hefty prison sentences for that. But it does kind of look like we're starting to change our mind a little bit, and we can probably expect to see some changes to the written law in regards to that. Another example might be women's participation in voting as we're coming up this year, and as we have yearly elections. Women who tried to vote used to be arrested, thrown in prison. Now, luckily, we don't do that anymore, but we've had to evolve from that place. We've had to change our mind. We've had to kind of challenge the written law as it is. So our opinions on what's deviant and which deviant behaviors are necessarily harmful or warrant formal sanctions do change over the time. So again, crime isn't necessarily constant. We as a society decide at any given point what behaviors are criminal and subject to criminal consequences. So again, I'm going to reiterate this over and over again because sometimes they do conflate the terms deviance and criminal. They're not the same thing. Some acts can be criminal and they're inherently deviant, but some acts can be deviant but not inherently criminal. And this does change over time. So what was once just a deviant behavior, just kind of a nuisance, we can decide that, oh, that's really bugging us and we need to actually change the law. And then that once deviant behavior that was not criminal becomes criminal after we decide that it's bothered us to a certain extent. So it does change over time. So space matters when we're talking about deviance and where we kind of have to decide what behavior is appropriate in what context. So our perceptions of what behavior is deviant or disruptive kind of depends on where we are in a physical space when the act is done. So for example, it might be totally okay and acceptable to brawl at a hockey game. That might be seen as totally acceptable, totally normal, kind of part of the culture. But maybe you don't want to brawl during church. That's kind of a different space. So it's going to be deviant in church, but, pretty normal at a hockey game. Similar subject, crazy dress is accepted on Halloween, but not necessarily during other days of the year. So we do reserve space where certain typically deviant behaviors aren't anymore. So space does matter as well as historical time. So let's talk a little bit about the types of crime. I'm not going to get super into this. If you are interested in these topics, I love crime. I am a criminologist by training. So I kind of hate to breeze over all of this, but if you are interested, we do have a criminology major here at Kansas State University, so I do encourage you to look into that, maybe see if there's some courses that you can take to kind of expand and really narrow in on your specific interests towards crime. So again, this is just unfortunately a very surface level overview, but I do encourage you to look into that. So types of crime. Crime can primarily be divided into two main categories. So first, there's going to be the crimes against property. So there's sort of people involved, but you aren't like assaulting the person or the being itself. So that's going to be things like vandalism, graffiti, property theft, slash tires. No person or animal got hurt, but you are acting against their property. Meanwhile, there's crimes against beings, and beings include animals, they include businesses. Sometimes it's hard to think of Target as like a conglomeration of individuals, but when you do shoplift from Target, you are technically offending against a group of people. So businesses do count in this instance. And then of course, animals as well. Here's just some additional types of crime. I'll give you a chance to look over those kind of on your own time. Feel free to pause this if you'd like to take a look. But just to break it down, there is interpersonal violence, we've got property crime, there's organized crime, cyber crime, white collar crime, and then morality crime. Morality crime is kind of interesting. It's just typically victimless, so it kind of offends our sensibilities to just enough where we think that, maybe the police should go break that up, but technically they're not offending against any property of people. So um, these crimes, which include illegal gambling, illegal prostitution, drug abuse, vagrancy, and public nudity, they're not really hurting us, but we're still not comfortable enough with it that we can just let it go without a formal sanction. And these are highly debated. These are probably going to be the main ones that change over time. So let's talk a little bit about why crime happens. So we're going to talk a little bit more about theory. Hopefully you can kind of refresh your brain here. We're going to start off with Durkheim. So crime for Durkheim is the inevitable result of societal growth and the emergence of different opinions about norms and values among groups. And to Durkheim, crime does serve a function, and it helps us to draw and maintain boundaries between what we think is acceptable versus unacceptable behavior. So essentially, it allows us to state where we draw the line as a society. Crime also functions to open up opportunities for social change. So by committing crime, people are violating the norm, but maybe that norm needs to change. If we all just went along all the time, nothing would ever change. So it does serve a function for Durkheim. So aside from Durkheim, I'm going to introduce a new theorist. This guy's name is Robert Merton. You don't really need to know his name. We're just going to talk about him really briefly, but if you do gain an interest in criminology, he's a really big figure there. He's definitely branching off of Durkheim. So for Merton, crime happens when people are unable to achieve what society wants them to through any legitimate or legal means. So something like wealth, if people don't have the natural pathways to wealth, or they have fewer resources than other people, they might have to kind of adjust and make some adaptations. So they're going to seek out alternative means to achieve instead. So essentially the goal remains the same, but the means to achieve it changes, and it changes based on a person's access to resources and their personal skill set. So again, Merton calls crime an adaptation to adversity in achieving societal goals. So for Merton, crime is a solution. It's an adaptation to adversity. It's an adaptation to the things that you're missing in order to achieve what society wants you to achieve. And he comes up with 5 main adaptations. This is pretty nitpicky. You won't need to know these for any kind of exam. But just out of interest, this is kind of his basic theory. So the first adaptation is conformity. Most people fall into this category. Again, conformity, it just happens when a person accepts society's goals and is acceptable means to achieve them. So, they accept the American dream of, you need a house, you need to care for your family, you need a good education, and I'm just going to get that through the normal means. So I'm going to do a 9-to-5 job. I'm going to do everything kind of by the book. The next adaptation is innovation. So a person still accepts society's goals, but they can't achieve them through the acceptable means. That could be due to a lack of resources, choice, whatever. So either way, they seek out other, often illegal ways to do so. So for example, the goal of wealth remains the same, but instead of doing a 9-to-5 job, somebody might go into drug dealing or shoplifting. There's also ritualism. So a person doesn't even really believe in or necessarily care about society's goals. So wealth and money making might not really mean anything to them, but they're just going through the grind anyway. So they don't really care about the goals, but they're still going to follow through on the means. They're just not necessarily driven by achievement of that goal. Retreatism happens when a person rejects society's goals, so that they just totally kind of fall back away from society. They don't even try to attempt to achieve the goals. They're not looking for other means. They're not reformulating. They're not innovating. They're just kind of retreating, kind of backing away from society, withdrawing. They've kind of given up. So a group of people that might fit into this group might be, unfortunately, drug addicts. So they often don't hold jobs. They don't necessarily care about making money. All they need is a fix. So that one's probably one of the most rare of the adaptations, but it's there. And the final adaptation is rebellion. So a person seeks to challenge society's existing goals and the current means to achieve them. So they're kind of rejecting both the original goals and the means. So maybe they're just kind of like, well, screw wealth. We don't really need it. And what does wealth get us anyway? Maybe we should start looking for new goals and new means. So they're kind of just rejecting the system in general. So think about this just to yourself. If you need to pause, that's fine. How would you describe the American dream? Has it become easier, a little bit more difficult to attain right now? What are some barriers that people might face in attaining the American dream? And again, try to use your sociological imagination, think outside of yourself and your own social conditions, and try to put yourself in other people's shoes. And also, what are some non-conventional ways that people try to achieve the American dream? So what's something other than a 9 to 5 job? What's something other than getting a college degree? This can be people you know, people you see in film. Either way, just give it some thought. So the next series we're going to talk about, their names are Cloward and Olin, and they come up with their subcultural theory of crime. So for them, people are drawn towards crime because they feel accepted and secure in the company of other criminals. This is relating back to subcultures. Hopefully you can remember that definition from a little bit ago. Criminal subcultures set new and accessible goals for and the means to achieve it. In ways that are otherwise unaccepted by others in society. So whereas general society, you want to achieve wealth and you need to get that through a 9 to 5 job, some cultures, some subcultures argue that maybe gang fighting can be a way to achieve status. So it's just a different goal and a different means. It's just more accessible to the certain population that we're dealing with. Another example might be drug dealing as a way to achieve wealth. Next, we're going to talk about Edwin Sutherland's theory of crime. So for Sutherland, people are more likely to become deviant and commit crime when they hang around others who commit crime and deem it acceptable. So it's kind of a birds of a feather flock together sort of a theory. So the more deviant people that a person encounters and the stronger the emotional attachment that person has to them, the more likely it is that they will end up committing crime or kind of joining the criminal lifestyle. So they might begin to accept crime even if they didn't before. They might want to belong to a particular group of people even more than they want to conform to a broader society. And sometimes that group can provide them with more protection than they would have in other society, or maybe they have strong family connections to the group, so there's kind of a sense of loyalty there. You might think of like maybe mob families fitting into that description. Criminologists are still kind of debating with and dealing with whether a person's deviance comes before or after they connect with their deviance. So it's kind of a chicken versus the egg argument. So do people become deviant once they meet other deviants, or are they deviant and just happen to seek out others who are deviant because they're like them? So again, this is still kind of up for debate. It's probably the biggest critique of Sutherland's theory, but it is there. And it probably likely depends on the person. So for some people, the chicken does come before the egg, and for some people, the egg comes before the chicken. I don't know how generalizable we can actually make this in this case. But just so you know, that is a debate regarding Sutherland's theory. All right, so the next theory we're going to cover, it's another really major one in criminology, is routine activities theory. So for routine activities theory, crime depends on opportunity. So a crime isn't going to happen if the opportunity doesn't present itself. A crime is most likely to occur when the motivated offender meets a suitable and unguarded target in time and space. So if crime is more likely to occur when you've got the offender there, he wants to offend, he wants that lady's purse who's walking down the street. He notices that the lady is suitable because she's got the purse he wants into, and there doesn't appear to be anybody else around. So therefore, that is the opportunity that allows crime to happen. Statistically, people are way more likely to get victimized by somebody they know than a stranger. Why might this be? Here's some reasons. People you know your routines. They know when you come home. They know where you work. They kind of have a general idea of your school and work hours. They know what you have. So maybe they've been inside your house before. They know that you have a collection of really nice bags or a nice shoe collection. They've maybe seen you take out of a piggy bank in your house, so they know what that is. They're more likely to come into contact with you on a regular basis. So a stranger might run into you once, whereas a friend or a family member will run into you hundreds of times. Also, victims are less likely to report somebody they know to the police than they are to report a stranger. So why? They might feel feelings of loyalty. They might feel feelings of shame. They might even fear retaliation if they know that person. They know that person knows their routines and their schedule. So it could be dangerous to report. But either way, people are far more likely to get victimized by somebody they know. So lastly, we have Howard Becker's labeling theory of crime. So for Becker, people are more likely to turn to criminal behavior when they feel that they've been rejected and shamed by society. So they don't. So if they do an action that they didn't really intend to be harmful, but other people took it as such and just wouldn't let it go, they don't feel like they've ever been forgiven or accepted back into society. They might perceive society as viewing them as unredeemable or a lost cause. So once that happens, once they've kind of notice that people are labeling them that way, that that's the perception society has of them, they kind of start to embrace that label that's placed on them and stop kind of seeking to conform to society. So they've kind of given up. It's a somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if they say I am, then I am. Children who are described by adults as something like a bad seed, as they're crazy, as they're psycho, maybe even something as simple as difficult, they hear this and they're more likely to embrace these labels and feel rejected by society and just accept that that's who they are. So when we are dealing with kids, we do need to be very careful. So what do you think? What are some ways of being labeled as a young child as out of control, disruptive, and non-compliant? This can be done by teachers, parents, providers. How do you think that might affect their behavior later on in life? What do you think that internalization of those words, of those labels, might do to them and impact their behavior later on? So, what are some alternative descriptions we should use, or ways that we can try to understand why a child is acting out? So, how can we avoid labeling them and hopefully put them on a better path than they might be heading down? Just kind of keep that in mind, especially if you are interested in healthcare, education, social work, anything like that, where you might encounter kids. We have to be very careful about how we talk about them and how we talk to them. So, why do we learn about crime? What does learning about crime really matter? Well, crime has really harmful effects and it goes far beyond just the offender and just the victim. So, of course, crime is harmful to victims. It can cause emotional damage, financial damage, physical damage. Crime's also harmful to communities. So, regardless of whatever they've done to get themselves in prison, it's likely that people who have offended and are now in jails and prisons, they played a role in their community. You know, maybe they were spouses, they were dads, moms, sisters, so they were something to somebody. Maybe they had a meaningful job in their neighborhood. So when they go to prison, it harms the communities. Kids lose parents, they lose guardians, they can lose a sense of safety and cohesion. Neighbors might begin to mistrust each other. Spouses are left on their own with not a reliable source of income. So it can be very damaging to communities as a whole. Crime is also debilitating for offenders. So once they go to prison, they don't come out the same. We don't do enough to get them rehabilitated back into their communities. So when they get out, they're facing broken families. It can be really difficult to get a job now that they've got a felony on their record. They have more criminal associations than they did when they went in. So they've met all these people. Now they're really connected to the criminal system. So once they can't get a job, it's likely that they're going to do what Merton says and adapt, innovate. And now they have a subculture that's going to support criminal activity that they can now belong to if they're not readily accepted back into conventional society. So that is a risk. And that's why they tend to come back. When they come back to prison after being in, we call that recidivism. And recidivism is very high, unfortunately. Next, crime is costly to the system. The system meaning the state and us as taxpayers. We pay for food, we pay for beds, we pay for court costs. We're paying police and judges. So it's very expensive. And when we have a lot of people in prison or jails that we're trying to upkeep, it's just very costly and kind of places a burden on the system. So again, the effects of crime extend far beyond just the victim and the offender. We learn about crime so it can help us to consider whether or not what we're doing in terms of punishment and lawmaking is working. Maybe there's some things that we still think are really weird, but maybe we should let up on. That way we can kind of start to reduce the prison population. And we can stop taking parents away from kids. Maybe there's a way. Maybe we can start to change. We can consider how important certain norm violations are to us anymore and make changes. So again, this is kind of happening with weed legalization. We're starting to kind of change the tide on that. We've kind of decided that, well, you don't necessarily have to accept weed, but you kind of realize that maybe it's not as harmful as we once thought, and that's totally up to opinion. But just in general, that is becoming more accepted. And hardly anybody in society is left untouched by crime in some way. A lot of people are criminals themselves. They've been a victim of crime, they're a family member of a victim or an offender, or they could be an employer and they're kind of grappling with whether they want to hire people with felonies on their records. So even if you don't go into criminology, even if your field isn't related to crime at all, it's likely that yourself or the people that you're working with have been touched by crime in some way. So it is important to kind of consider crime and its widespread harmful effects on victims, communities, offenders, and the system in general. So it does matter. I know a lot of you are very interested in this, and that's great. And I hope that you will continue to kind of keep that up despite whatever the subject is that you're interested in, because crime is always going to matter. So that is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. That's one of my favorite sections to go over. So hopefully we'll have some fun with the worksheet this week. And that is everything. So just email me as usual if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help you. Have a good week. Thanks.